Nero Wolfe and the Sabotage at Sea. It was a Friday morning in October, when trouble walked through our front door, and like most trouble worth mentioning, it came wearing expensive shoes and a desperate expression. I was sitting at my desk in the office, trying to make sense of Wolfe's orchid expenditures for the month, a task roughly equivalent to explaining quantum physics to one of Fritz's soufflé, when the doorbell rang. From upstairs came the familiar sound of Wolfe's elevator descending. 9:15 on the dot. As always, the man's punctuality would make a Swiss clockmaker weep with envy. In another minute, he'd settle his seventh of a ton into the chair behind his desk, arrange the morning mail with the precision of a Renaissance master, and begin his daily communion with the Gazette. But first, we had a visitor. I opened the front door to find a woman who looked like she'd stepped out of a Park Avenue portrait, assuming the portrait had been painted during an earthquake. She was maybe 40, with the kind of bone structure that suggested good breeding and the kind of tremor in her hands that suggested bad news. Her navy suit probably cost more than most people's cars, but she wore it like armor that had already taken too many hits. "Mr. Goodwin?" Her voice had the cultured clip of old money, with an undercurrent of something I couldn't quite place. Fear, maybe, or fury. "I must speak with Mr. Wolfe immediately. It's about the Aphrodite." "The what now?" "The luxury liner. She sails tomorrow evening." She stopped, glancing over my shoulder, as if expecting to see eavesdroppers lurking behind Fritz's coat rack. "Please, people are going to die." Well, that got my attention. I stepped aside and gestured her in. Names first, tragedy second. House rules. Victoria Ashworth. She clutched a leather purse like it contained the crown jewels. "Mrs. Charles Ashworth. My husband owns Meridian Shipping Lines." The elevator wheezed to a stop, and Wolfe's measured tread announced his arrival in the office. I followed Mrs. Ashworth in, noting how her eyes went wide when she saw him. Most people have that reaction the first time. Nero Wolfe behind his desk is a sight to behold. A mountain of a man with a face that could have been carved by Michelangelo if Michelangelo had specialized in shrewd, immovable boulders. "Good morning," Wolfe rumbled, not looking up from his mail. "Archie, who is our guest?" "Mrs. Victoria Ashworth, wife of Charles Ashworth, who apparently owns ships. She's worried about something called the Aphrodite and thinks people are going to die. I figured you'd want to hear this before your morning paper." Wolfe's eyes flicked to Mrs. Ashworth, then back to his correspondence. "I don't investigate maritime disasters, madam. The ocean and I have a mutual understanding. I stay away from it, and it refrains from coming to my house." Mrs. Ashworth took a step forward, her voice rising. "Mr. Wolfe, you don't understand. Someone is planning to sabotage the Aphrodite. She's our newest ship, the crown jewel of the line. Tomorrow night she sails for Southampton with 800 passengers, including some of the most prominent families in New York. If something happens, then I suggest you contact the Coast Guard, the FBI, or perhaps a good maritime insurance investigator." Wolfe opened the first letter with his ivory paper knife, precise as a surgeon. "I don't travel, Mrs. Ashworth. Not to ships, not to crimes, not even to accept awards. Archie handles all excursions beyond these walls. But someone tried to kill me last night." That stopped even Wolfe's paper knife. He set it down with deliberate care and raised his eyes to meet hers. Behind us, I heard the soft pad of paws on carpet. Diana, one of our Dobermans, had wandered in from the kitchen where she'd probably been charming breakfast scraps out of Fritz. The other four would be scattered throughout the house. As always, our early warning system with teeth. "Elaborate," Wolfe said. Mrs. Ashworth's hands were definitely shaking now. She sat down in the red leather chair without invitation, which told me more about her state of mind than a full psychological profile. "Last evening around 10 o'clock, I was returning from a charity dinner at the plaza. My driver stopped for a red light at 5th and 62nd, and a man approached the car. I thought perhaps he wanted directions, but instead he threw something at my window, some kind of acid. If the glass hadn't been bulletproof." She opened her purse and extracted a photograph, sliding it across Wolfe's desk. I leaned over to look. It showed the back seat of what was probably a Rolls, with the window starred and pitted as if someone had attacked it with a blowtorch. The police said it was probably a random attack, she continued. But this morning I found this in my morning mail. Another item from the purse, a single sheet of expensive paper with a message cut from newspaper letters, like something out of a dime novel. Cancel the maiden voyage or join Davy Jones. Wolfe studied the note without touching it. Melodramatic but effective. Tell me about this sabotage you mentioned. Mrs. Ashworth glanced at me, then back at Wolfe. 3 days ago, our head of security, a man named Morrison, came to my husband with concerns about the final preparations for the Aphrodite. Supplies that didn't match the manifests, workers who couldn't account for their time, small but significant damage to non-critical systems. Morrison suspected organized sabotage, but before he could complete his investigation, yes, he fell into the Hudson, at night, alone. Her voice was flat now. The emotion leached out. The police called it an accident. My husband wanted to believe them. But Morrison was a former Navy diver. He didn't just fall into rivers and drown. Wolfe leaned back in his chair, which groaned in familiar protest. I knew that look. His brain was already working on the problem, sifting through possibilities like a master chef selecting ingredients. But I also knew what came next. Mrs. Ashworth, your situation is undoubtedly serious, but as I've explained, maritime investigations are not $100,000. The office went quiet, except for Diana's gentle panting and the distant sound of Fritz humming something operatic in the kitchen. Wolfe's eyebrows climbed toward his hairline.
I beg your pardon.
$100,000 if you can identify the saboteur and prevent disaster. Another 100 if you can prove Morrison was murdered. She leaned forward, desperation finally breaking through her Park Avenue composure. Mr. Wolfe, I don't care if you never set foot on the ship, but 800 people are going to sail tomorrow night, and I believe someone intends to kill them all. If you won't help for justice, help for money. If not for money, then for the satisfaction of proving that even the ocean can't defeat Nero Wolfe's mind. Well, that was neatly done. Appeal to his greed, then to his ego. Mrs. Ashworth might be frightened, but she wasn't stupid. Wolfe was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming silently on the desk. Outside, a taxi honked, and somewhere in the house, another of our Dobermans, probably Mars, padded down the hallway on patrol. Archie, Wolfe said finally, call Saul Panzer. Tell him to meet you at the Meridian Line's offices in an hour. Mrs. Ashworth will provide you with a complete list of everyone who has had access to the Aphrodite during the past month. Crew, passengers, dock workers, suppliers, inspectors, and casual visitors. I also want Morrison's personnel file, his investigation notes, and the police report on his death.
You'll take the case?
Mrs. Ashworth's relief was audible. I'll examine the facts. Whether I take the case depends on what Archie discovers. Wolfe picked up his paper knife again. But I warn you, madam, if there is indeed a saboteur planning mass murder, I will find them. And when I do, they will face not merely the law, but the full weight of my displeasure. The ocean may be vast and mysterious, but human nature is neither, and it is with human nature that I excel. Mrs. Ashworth stood, clutching her purse like a lifeline. Thank you, Mr. Wolfe. Thank you both. After I saw her out, I returned to find Wolfe staring at the threatening note, his lips pushed out in the expression that meant his brain was shifting into high gear. So, I said, settling behind my desk, another day, another death threat. What's your read on Mrs. Ashworth? Frightened, certainly, possibly lying about some details, but not about the central facts. The attack on her car was real. That window damage would be expensive to fake, and pointless besides. He set the note aside carefully. Call Inspector Kramer as well. If Morrison's death was indeed murder, the police file will be incomplete but illuminating. And if this really is sabotage, aimed at sinking a luxury liner full of rich people, Wolfe's eyes glinted. Then someone has made the mistake of believing that distance grants immunity from justice. They are about to learn otherwise. I reached for the phone, already mentally preparing for another of our adventures in other people's troubles. Outside, the October morning was crisp and bright, and somewhere across the city, the Aphrodite waited at her dock, loaded with secrets, surrounded by enemies, and scheduled to sail tomorrow night into whatever darkness someone had planned for her. But first, coffee. Even impending maritime disasters had to wait for Fritz's coffee. By the time I got back from the Meridian Line's offices, it was past 4 o'clock, and my feet felt like I'd walked the length of Manhattan twice, which, come to think of it, I probably had. The docks are no place for a man in decent shoes, but duty calls, and when duty involves a possible mass murder, you answer in whatever footwear you've got. I found Wolfe in the office, 3 empty beer bottles lined up beside his blotter like golden soldiers, studying what looked like blueprints spread across his desk. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, catching the dust motes and turning them into tiny dancers. Caesar, our biggest Doberman, was stretched out near the window, one eye open in case anything interesting happened. "You look like a man who's discovered something unpleasant," I said, hanging my coat on the rack. "Several unpleasant things." Wolfe tapped the blueprints with one thick finger. "Mrs. Ashworth had these delivered an hour ago. Deck plans for the Aphrodite. I have been contemplating the various ways one might sabotage such a vessel, and the contemplation has been most enlightening." I moved around behind his chair to look. The ship was massive, 12 decks, nearly 1,000 feet long, with accommodations for 800 passengers and a crew of 400. It was like a floating city, complete with restaurants, shops, a theater, and enough lifeboats to handle everyone aboard. At least, that's what the plans showed. Enlightening how? Consider the possibilities, Archie. An explosion in the engine room would cripple but not necessarily sink her. A fire in the passenger quarters would create panic, but could be contained. But what if someone had access to the ship during construction? What if critical safety systems were compromised in ways that wouldn't become apparent until the ship was at sea, beyond help? I pulled up a chair. Morrison was investigating irregularities in supplies and worker schedules. Maybe he found something specific. Perhaps. "What did you learn at the offices?" I flipped open my notebook. Plenty, and most of it interesting. Morrison's investigation notes were more thorough than Mrs. Ashworth let on. 3 separate incidents over the past month, a shipment of life preservers that tested 20% below Coast Guard standards, electrical wiring in the communications room that didn't match the specifications, and a whole batch of emergency flares that turned out to be duds. Wolfe's eyebrows rose. Individually, these might be attributed to normal manufacturing defects or shipping errors, but together, they paint a picture of someone systematically undermining the ship's emergency systems. Morrison thought so too. His last report, dated the day before he died, recommended postponing the maiden voyage pending a complete safety inspection. And Mr. Ashworth's response? That's where it gets interesting. According to Morrison's secretary, a sharp lady named Miss Chen, Ashworth never saw that report. Morrison was supposed to deliver it personally the next morning, but that night he took his unscheduled swim in the Hudson. Wolfe leaned back, the chair protesting as usual. Outside, I could hear Fritz starting dinner preparations, which meant it was getting close to the time when Wolfe's attention would shift from crime to cuisine. But not yet. What of the passenger list? Now that's fascinating reading. I flipped to another page. We've got 3 senators, a Supreme Court justice, the ambassador to France, 2 cabinet members' wives, and enough Wall Street money to buy a small country, plus 1 passenger who checked in this morning under the name James Morrison. Ah, Wolfe's eyes glinted. Someone with a sense of irony, or someone who wishes us to know they were responsible for the real Morrison's death. Gets better. I had Saul run a background check on that name. James Morrison, age 35, occupation listed as import-export consultant, paid for his first-class suite in cash. Address turns out to be a vacant lot in Queens. And the crew? Captain's name is Henrik Larsson, Norwegian, 30 years at sea, clean record. But his first officer is a man named Dmitry Kozlov, formerly of the Soviet Merchant Marine, defected 5 years ago, been working American ships ever since, clean record too, but recent defectors sometimes carry complicated loyalties. Yes, what else? I consulted my notes again. The ship's chief engineer is a woman named Sarah Blackwood, 42, graduated from MIT, worked for Meridian for 15 years. According to her personnel file, she's been acting strange lately, missed meetings, seemed distracted, asked unusual questions about the ship's safety systems. Defining unusual. Questions like how long the emergency power would last if the main engines failed, whether the watertight doors could be operated manually if the electrical systems went down, that sort of thing. Could be professional thoroughness. Could be something else. Wolfe nodded slowly. Continue. Then there's the passenger angle. I talked to the booking agent, and 3 first-class suites were reserved and paid for just this week. Cash payments. No advance reservations. One is our mysterious James Morrison. The other 2 are traveling under the names Heinrich Wagner and Maria Santos. German and Spanish. Maybe, or maybe someone wants us to think international intrigue. Wagner's supposed to be a businessman from Hamburg. Santos claims to be an art dealer from Madrid. Both paid cash. Both provided addresses that'll probably turn out to be as fictional as Morrison's. Wolfe was quiet for several minutes, staring at the ship's blueprints. Caesar yawned and shifted position, still keeping one eye on the room. From upstairs came the sound of the elevator, probably Apollo or Minerva, checking on Wolfe's orchids, a daily ritual that helped keep the plants and the dogs content. Archie, call Inspector Kramer. Tell him I require his presence here at 8 o'clock this evening. Also call Mrs. Ashworth and ask her to join us at the same time. What about Mr. Ashworth? Him as well, if he's available. It's time we had a more complete picture of what we're dealing with. I reached for the phone, but it rang before I could pick it up. 3 rings. Fritz's signal that dinner was ready. Wolfe immediately began clearing the blueprints from his desk with the focused efficiency of a man whose stomach has issued orders. After dinner, he said, standing. And Archie?
Yeah?
Call Saul again. Tell him to position himself at the dock, where the Aphrodite is moored. I want to know everyone who goes aboard tonight, and I want to know it immediately. You think something's going to happen before tomorrow's sailing? I think, Archie, that whoever killed Morrison and threatened Mrs. Ashworth is not the sort to wait patiently while we investigate. They will act, and when they do, I want to be ready. He headed for the dining room, where Fritz's latest culinary masterpiece awaited. I made the calls, then followed the sound of clinking silverware and contented rumbling. Whatever was coming, it could wait until after the veal medallions. But as I passed the window, I glanced out at the street and noticed a man in a dark coat standing under the streetlight across from our house. He'd been there when I came home, and he was still there now, pretending to read a newspaper in the growing dusk. I made a mental note to mention it to Wolfe after dinner. In our business, watchers usually meant trouble was coming, and we already had plenty of that. Saturday morning found me back at the waterfront before the sun had properly warmed the October air. The docks at dawn are something to see, all fog and shadows, and the kind of atmosphere that makes you expect Humphrey Bogart to step out from behind a cargo container. The Aphrodite loomed out of the mist like a floating palace, all gleaming white superstructure and brass fittings that caught what little light filtered through the haze. Saul Panzer was waiting for me at the dock gate, looking like he'd been carved out of the morning itself. Saul has a gift for blending into his surroundings that would make a chameleon jealous. This morning he was dressed like a longshoreman, complete with work boots and a thermos of coffee that probably contained actual coffee, not the surveillance props most private operatives favor. Interesting night, he said, by way of greeting. Define interesting. 3 people went aboard after midnight. 2 came off before dawn, 1 didn't. He handed me a sheet of paper covered with his precise handwriting. Times, descriptions and license plates were available. I scanned his notes. At 12:47 a.m., a woman matching Sarah Blackwood's description had used a crew key to board the ship. She'd emerged at 1:23 a.m., carrying a small satchel she hadn't had going in. At 2:15 a.m., a man fitting Captain Larson's description had gone aboard and stayed until 3:30 a.m. And at 3:45 a.m., someone Saul described as medium height, dark coat, moved like he knew where he was going, had boarded using what looked like a passenger key. The last one didn't come back off? Not by the time I left to meet you. Could still be aboard. Could have left by another route. Ship's got service entrances on the far side. I folded the paper and tucked it into my coat. Good work. Now let's see what we can learn in daylight. The dock was bustling with activity as the ship's crew made final preparations for the evening departure. Supplies were being loaded, last-minute repairs were being made, and somewhere in the organized chaos, a saboteur might be putting finishing touches on a plan to commit mass murder. Our first stop was the harbour master's office, where a cup of coffee and my natural charm got us a look at the overnight security logs. The harbour police had made their regular rounds, but nothing had been noted out of the ordinary. Of course, the harbour police weren't looking for subtle sabotage. They were watching for obvious trouble like drunken sailors and cargo theft. "You gentlemen looking for something specific?" The voice belonged to a weathered man in a harbour patrol uniform who'd been watching us read the logs. "Private investigators," I said, showing him my license. "We're working for Meridian Shipping Lines on some security concerns about the Aphrodite." His expression sharpened. "What kind of concerns?" "The kind that might involve postponing tonight's sailing. You hear anything unusual about that ship?" He glanced around, then lowered his voice. "Matter of fact, I did. My partner worked the graveyard shift last night, and he mentioned seeing some activity around the ship that seemed off. People boarding at odd hours, staying too long, that sort of thing." "Your partner around?" "Off duty till tonight, but he did say one thing that stuck with me. He thought he saw someone go over the side around 4 this morning. Not off the dock, off the ship itself, like they were leaving by a way that wouldn't show up on the gangway logs." Saul and I exchanged glances. "Anyone report it?" Partner wasn't sure what he saw. Fog was pretty thick. And it happened fast. Could have been crew doing maintenance. Could have been someone who didn't want to be seen leaving. We thanked him and headed for the ship itself. The Aphrodite looked even more impressive up close, a floating monument to luxury and human engineering. But as we approached the gangway, my attention was caught by something that didn't belong in the pristine maritime picture. There was a small crowd gathered near the stern, and it included 2 uniformed police officers. "Trouble," Saul observed. We made our way through the crowd to where a harbour patrol boat was tied up alongside the ship. Whatever they'd found, it was serious enough to bring out the brass. I recognized Inspector Kramer's bulky form near the ship's rail, looking about as happy as a man with chronic indigestion. "Kramer!" I called out. He turned, saw me, and his expression went from unhappy to actively pained. "Goodwin, I should have known. What are you doing here?" "Working a case." Same question back at you. "We fished a body out of the water an hour ago. Male, mid-30s, no identification. Appears to have gone into the water sometime early this morning." My blood went a little cold. Description? About 5'10", brown hair, wearing a dark coat and decent shoes. Why? I looked at Saul, who nodded grimly. Because we may have watched him go in. Someone boarded this ship around 3:45 this morning and never came back off, at least not the conventional way. Kramer's eyes went flat and dangerous. "Explain." I gave him a quick rundown of our surveillance and what we'd learned from the harbour patrol. By the time I finished, Kramer looked like he was ready to chew nails and spit out ship anchors. "So you're telling me we've got a murdered man in the water, sabotage concerns about this ship, and it sails tonight with 800 passengers. That's about the size of it. And I suppose Wolfe's involved in this somehow." Mrs. Victoria Ashworth hired him yesterday to investigate possible sabotage. She's supposed to meet with him this evening, along with her husband and hopefully you. Kramer looked at his watch, then at the ship, then at me. "Goodwin, I want you and your associate to get off this dock and stay off. This is now a police investigation, and I don't need you muddying the waters." "With respect, Inspector, we were hired by the ship's owner. We have a right to..." "You have the right to get out of my way before I run you in for interfering with a homicide investigation." But his tone was more tired than angry. Kramer and I had been through this dance enough times that we both knew the steps. "Look, I'll be at Wolfe's place tonight as requested, but until then, I want you clear of this scene." Fair enough. We'd learned what we came for, and then some. The mysterious third boarder was probably dead, which meant either he'd been killed to keep him quiet, or he'd been killed because he'd tried to stop whatever was planned for the ship. As we walked back toward the dock gate, Saul spoke quietly. The woman who went aboard first, Blackwood, the chief engineer, she emerged with something she hadn't brought in. Evidence, maybe, or tools for sabotage, or both. If she discovered something that threatened the saboteur's plan, and if the dead man was trying to stop her, I nodded. The pieces were starting to fit together, but the picture they made wasn't pretty. Someone was definitely planning something for the Aphrodite, and they were willing to kill to protect their plan. Come on, I said. Let's get back to the brownstone. Wolfe's going to want a full report, and I have a feeling this evening's meeting just got a lot more interesting. As we left the docks, I took one last look at the ship. In a few hours, she'd be sliding out into New York Harbor with her cargo of wealthy passengers, heading into the North Atlantic darkness, and somewhere aboard, or planning to be aboard, was someone who intended to make sure she never reached Southampton. The fog was lifting, but somehow the morning didn't seem any brighter. Back at the brownstone, I found Wolfe in the office with the morning mail arranged in neat piles and a fresh bottle of beer at his elbow. The sight of those familiar routines was reassuring after the morning's unpleasantness at the docks. Minerva was curled up in a patch of sunlight near the bookshelf, and the whole scene radiated the kind of ordered calm that makes the outside world's chaos seem manageable. Until I told him about the body in the harbor. Murdered, Wolfe said. It wasn't a question. Almost certainly. Kramer's treating it as homicide. The timing's too convenient for coincidence. Someone boards the ship in the early morning hours, never comes back off the gangway, and turns up dead in the water a few hours later. And you believe this was our mysterious James Morrison? Could be. Won't know for sure until they identify the body, but the timing fits. I settled behind my desk and pulled out my notebook. There's more. According to Saul's observations, Sarah Blackwood, the chief engineer, went aboard around midnight and came off carrying something she hadn't brought in. Wolfe's eyebrows climbed. Indeed. And what do we know of this Sarah Blackwood? I flipped through my notes from yesterday's interviews. 42, MIT graduate, 15 years with Meridian Shipping, divorced, no children, lives alone in a Brooklyn Heights apartment. According to her colleagues, she's been acting strangely lately, distracted, asking unusual questions about emergency systems. What manner of questions? How long the emergency power would last, whether safety systems could be operated manually, that sort of thing. Her supervisor thought she was being unusually thorough in preparation for the maiden voyage, or unusually interested in how to disable those systems. Wolfe took a sip of beer, considering. What of the other principals? I did some more digging this morning before meeting Saul. Charles Ashworth himself is interesting. Built Meridian Shipping from nothing over the past 20 years, but the company's been hemorrhaging money lately. Competition from larger lines, rising fuel costs, labor troubles. The Aphrodite represents a huge gamble for him. If she's successful, she could save the company. If she's not, he faces bankruptcy. Exactly. Which gives him motive to arrange his own sabotage for the insurance money, except that his wife hired us to prevent exactly that. Unless Mrs. Ashworth is unaware of her husband's true financial situation, or unless their marriage is less harmonious than it appears. Wolfe leaned back in his chair. Continue. Captain Henrik Larsson checks out clean. 30 years at sea, good record, no financial problems. But his first officer, Dmitry Kozlov, is more interesting. Soviet defector 5 years ago, been working American ships since then. Clean record, but I found something curious in his immigration file. Yes, he defected while his ship was docked in New York, claiming political persecution, but according to his own statement, he was a mechanical engineer in the Soviet Navy before joining the Merchant Marine. That's specialized knowledge that could be very useful for sabotage, or very useful for preventing it. A man with detailed knowledge of ship engineering might spot sabotage that others would miss. True, but it's also worth noting that he went aboard last night around 2:15 and didn't emerge until 3:30. Hour and 15 minutes is a long time for a routine check. Wolfe was quiet for several minutes, his fingers drumming silently on the desk. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled past, and somewhere in the house, one of the dogs padded down a hallway, probably Apollo making his rounds. What of the passengers? That's where things get really interesting. I consulted my notes again. The 3 late reservations I mentioned, Morrison, Wagner, and Santos, all paid cash for first-class accommodations. But I did some more checking this morning, and there's something odd about the reservations themselves. Elaborate. They weren't made through normal booking channels. Someone with access to the ship's reservation system entered them directly, bypassing the usual procedures. The booking agent I talked to yesterday didn't even know about them until I asked specifically. Inside job.
It has to be.
Someone with computer access to Meridian's systems made those reservations and arranged payment through a method that wouldn't leave normal paper trails. And our mysterious James Morrison is likely dead in New York Harbor, which means someone is sailing tonight under his name. Or no one is, and the reservation was just a blind. But here's another wrinkle. I checked with immigration records, and neither Heinrich Wagner nor Maria Santos has any record of entering the United States recently. If they're really German and Spanish nationals, they came in some other way. Or they're Americans using false identities. Wolfe reached for his beer. What of the other passengers? That's a whole different kind of interesting. We've got Senator James Morrison. Yes, same name. Probably not a coincidence. Traveling with his wife and daughter. There's Supreme Court Justice Patricia Chen, the French ambassador's wife, 2 cabinet members' families, and enough Wall Street money to fund a small war. High-value targets. Exactly. If someone wanted to make a political statement, or eliminate specific individuals, or just create maximum chaos, you couldn't ask for a better passenger list. The phone rang. I answered it on the second ring. Nero Wolfe's office. Archie Goodwin speaking. Mr. Goodwin. The voice was strained, anxious. This is Victoria Ashworth. I need to see Mr. Wolfe immediately. What's happened?
My husband, Charles, he's gone.
He left the house early this morning and hasn't returned. His office says he never arrived, and, her voice caught, I found something in his study, something terrible. I looked at Wolfe, who was listening to my side of the conversation with the focused attention he usually reserved for discussions of orchid cultivation. Mrs. Ashworth, where are you now? At home, but I'm frightened to stay here alone. Could I come to your office? Of course, we'll expect you within the hour. I hung up and turned to Wolfe. Charles Ashworth has disappeared, and his wife found something in his study that has her terrified. Convenient timing, Wolfe observed dryly. His ship sails tonight. A man is murdered in the harbor this morning, and now he vanishes. Either he's fled because he's guilty of something, or someone has removed him to prevent interference with their plans. My money's on the second option. Mrs. Ashworth didn't sound like a woman whose husband had just confessed to planning mass murder. No, but she might sound like a woman whose husband had just become a liability to someone else's plans. Wolfe glanced at the clock on the wall. Call Inspector Kramer. Tell him Mrs. Ashworth will be joining us earlier than planned, and that we may have another missing person to add to his caseload. And tonight's meeting will proceed as scheduled, with or without Mr. Ashworth. In fact, his absence may prove more illuminating than his presence would have been. I reached for the phone again, but before I could dial, it rang once more. This time the voice was unfamiliar, male, with a slight accent I couldn't place. Mr. Goodwin, you don't know me, but I have information about the Aphrodite that Mr. Wolfe needs to hear. Information about what specifically? About who killed Morrison, and what's going to happen to the ship tonight. I can't talk on the phone, but I'll be at Pier 47 at 2 o'clock. Come alone. The line went dead. I looked at Wolfe, who had been listening with that peculiar stillness that meant his brain was working at full capacity. Well, I said, you'll go, naturally, but not alone. Have Saul position himself where he can observe, and make sure you're armed. You think it's a trap? I think, Archie, that we are dealing with people who have already committed at least 2 murders and are planning something far worse. Whether this caller is one of them or someone trying to stop them, the meeting will be dangerous. Just another typical Saturday afternoon in the Goodwin business. Indeed. And Archie.
Yeah?
When Mrs. Ashworth arrives, watch her carefully. Fear can be genuine and still conceal other emotions. If her husband has indeed disappeared, We need to know whether she's surprised by it. I nodded and reached for my coat. Outside, the October sun was trying to burn through the morning haze, and somewhere across the city, the Aphrodite waited at her dock, loaded with secrets and surrounded by enemies. In 8 hours, she would sail into the North Atlantic with 800 souls aboard. I had a feeling we were running out of time. Mrs. Ashworth arrived at the brownstone, looking like she'd aged 10 years since yesterday morning. The composed Park Avenue matron was gone, replaced by a woman whose hands shook as she clutched a manila envelope, like it contained a live snake. Diana padded into the office behind her, sensing distress with the uncanny intuition dogs have for human misery. "Mr. Wolfe," she began, then stopped, pressing her lips together, as if afraid of what might come out. "Please sit, madam. You said you found something in your husband's study?" She sank into the red leather chair and opened the envelope with trembling fingers. "Charles has a safe behind his desk. I've never known the combination, but this morning it was standing open, as if he'd left in a hurry and forgotten to lock it." She spread 3 documents across Wolfe's desk. The first was an insurance policy on the Aphrodite for $50 million. The second was a letter from Meridian's bank, dated 2 weeks ago, demanding immediate payment on outstanding loans totaling $37 million. The third was a contract with something called Baltic Maritime Salvage, dated yesterday, for deep water recovery services. Wolfe studied each document without touching them. "The salvage contract is most illuminating. Why would your husband require salvage services the day before his ship's maiden voyage?" "I don't know." Her voice was barely a whisper. "But there's more. I found his passport was missing, and his travel bag, the one he always keeps ready for emergencies, was gone from his closet." "You believe he's fled?"
I don't know what to believe.
Yesterday morning he was excited about the sailing, proud of what the Aphrodite represented for the company. But last night, she stopped, biting her lip.
Yes?
He received a phone call around 11 o'clock. I couldn't hear what was said, but afterward he went into his study, and I heard him opening the safe. This morning he was gone, and I found these papers. I looked at the documents again. 50 million in insurance on a ship that was sailing into danger, a company facing bankruptcy, and a husband who'd vanished with suspicious timing. Either Charles Ashworth was the saboteur himself, or someone had used the threat of exposure to force him to disappear. "Mrs. Ashworth," I said, "has your husband ever mentioned anyone named Sarah Blackwood, the ship's chief engineer?" "Yes, Charles spoke of her often. He said she was brilliant, dedicated, one of the best engineers he'd ever worked with. She was seen boarding the Aphrodite late last night and leaving with something she hadn't brought aboard. We're trying to understand what role she might be playing." Mrs. Ashworth frowned. "That doesn't sound like Sarah. She's always been completely professional, almost obsessively so. Charles said she treated the ship's engines like they were her children." The phone rang. I answered it, expecting Inspector Kramer, or maybe Saul with an update. Instead, I heard a voice that made my blood turn cold. "Mr. Goodwin, this is Sarah Blackwood." "Miss Blackwood, where are you?" "That's not important. What's important is that I need to speak with Mr. Wolfe immediately about the Aphrodite and about what's going to happen tonight." I looked at Wolfe, who nodded. "Hold on, Miss Blackwood. Mr. Wolfe would like to speak with you." Wolfe took the phone with his usual deliberate precision. "Miss Blackwood, I understand you have information regarding the sabotage of your ship." I could hear her voice through the receiver, high and strained. "Mr. Wolfe, I've done something terrible. I thought I was preventing a disaster, but I may have caused one instead." "Explain." "Last night I discovered that someone had been systematically tampering with the ship's safety systems, the life preservers, the emergency communications, even the watertight door controls. Everything had been subtly sabotaged in ways that wouldn't be noticed unless you knew exactly what to look for. And you knew what to look for. I'm the chief engineer. It's my job to know. But when I found the evidence, I removed it. I thought if I could gather proof and present it to the authorities this morning, we could stop the sailing and catch whoever was responsible. But something went wrong. When I got home, there was a man waiting for me. He said his name was Morrison. Not the real Morrison, obviously, but someone using his name. He knew what I'd found, and he made it clear that if I tried to expose the sabotage, people I cared about would be hurt. Wolfe's eyes met mine across the desk. What did this man want? He wanted the evidence I'd gathered, and he wanted me to replace it with false documentation that would make everything look normal. He said if I cooperated, the ship would sail safely and no one would be harmed. But if I didn't, you believed him. I didn't know what else to do. But this morning I heard about the body in the harbour, and I realized that the real Morrison, the one who was investigating the sabotage, had been murdered, which means the man who threatened me is probably the killer. Where are you now, Miss Blackwood? Somewhere safe. But Mr. Wolfe, I think I've made everything worse. The evidence I replaced, it's not just false. It's designed to make the ship's real problems look like routine maintenance issues. If the Aphrodite sails tonight, and if something goes wrong, the sabotage safety systems will fail, and there will be no record that they were ever compromised. Exactly. 800 people will die, and it will look like a tragic accident caused by equipment failure, not murder. I watched Mrs. Ashworth's face go white as she listened to our side of the conversation. Whatever she'd suspected about her husband, this was clearly worse than she'd imagined. Miss Blackwood, Wolfe continued, can you describe this man who threatened you? Medium height, dark hair, probably in his 30s. He spoke with a slight accent, European, maybe Russian, and he knew things about the ship that only someone with extensive maritime experience would know. Dmitry Kozlov, I said quietly. Wolfe nodded. Miss Blackwood, I want you to come to my office immediately. You'll be safe here, and we need your expertise to understand exactly what has been sabotaged and how.
I can't.
He's having me watched. But Mr. Wolfe, there's something else you need to know. The man who threatened me, he let something slip. He mentioned that the real target isn't the ship itself, it's someone on the passenger list. Someone important enough that killing 800 people is considered acceptable collateral damage. Who? He didn't say, but he did mention that after tonight, certain political problems would be permanently resolved. I think this is about more than insurance money or business rivalry. I think it's about assassination. The line went dead. I hung up and looked at Wolfe, then at Mrs. Ashworth, who was sitting frozen in her chair like a statue carved from pale marble. Mrs. Ashworth, Wolfe said gently, I need you to look at the passenger list and tell me if there's anyone aboard who might be the target of an assassination attempt. Someone whose death would have significant political ramifications. She took a shaky breath. Senator Morrison is aboard with his family. He's been leading the investigation into foreign influence in American shipping. Justice Chen is sailing as well. She's been writing the majority opinions on several cases involving international trade disputes. Ambassador Rousseau's wife is a passenger, and she's been negotiating some sensitive trade agreements. Any of whom would be worth killing if someone wanted to influence American foreign policy. Or, I added, all of whom would be worth killing if someone wanted to create maximum chaos in the American government. Mrs. Ashworth stood up abruptly. Mr. Wolfe, you have to stop that ship from sailing. Whatever it costs, whatever it takes, 800 innocent people cannot be allowed to sail into a death trap. I quite agree, madam. Unfortunately, stopping the sailing may be more difficult than catching the saboteur. Wolfe glanced at the clock. Archie, call Inspector Kramer, and tell him we need to meet immediately. Then call the Coast Guard, the FBI, and anyone else you can think of who might have authority to prevent the Aphrodite from leaving port. And if they won't listen, then we'll have to board the ship ourselves and stop the sabotage manually. I stared at him. Wolfe, you hate boats. I despise them, but I despise mass murder even more. His eyes were as hard as granite. Someone has turned that beautiful ship into a floating tomb, and they've done it with meticulous planning and ruthless efficiency. They've killed at least 2 people to protect their plan, and they're prepared to kill 800 more. But they made one critical error, Archie. They assumed that distance from their crime would grant them immunity from justice. They forgot that justice, like gravity, operates at any distance. Outside, the October afternoon was sliding toward evening, and somewhere across the city, The Aphrodite waited at her dock like a loaded weapon pointed at the heart of the North Atlantic. In 4 hours, she would sail. We had that long to stop a mass murder. The next 2 hours were a masterpiece of bureaucratic frustration. I spent most of them on the phone, bouncing from one official to another, like a pinball in a machine designed by sadists. The Coast Guard wanted evidence of specific safety violations. The FBI wanted proof of international terrorism. The Port Authority wanted documentation that couldn't be provided without a warrant. They wouldn't issue without evidence. We couldn't give them. Meanwhile, Wolfe sat behind his desk like a brooding mountain, occasionally making notes on a yellow pad, more often just staring at the ship's blueprints, with the focused intensity of a chess master contemplating a particularly vicious endgame. Mrs. Ashworth had retreated to the front room, where Fritz was plying her with tea and sympathy in equal measure. Through the office doorway, I could see her pacing like a caged leopard, occasionally stopping to stare out the window as if she could will her husband to appear on the front steps. At 4:30, Inspector Kramer arrived, looking like a man who'd spent the day wrestling with alligators and losing. He dropped into the chair beside my desk with the weary resignation of a public servant who'd seen too much and slept too little. "Goodwin, I hope you've got something better than theories and coincidences, because that's all I've got, and it's not nearly enough. What did you learn about our harbor victim?" "Male, mid-30s, no identification, been in the water maybe 6 hours when we pulled him out. Cause of death was a blow to the head, probably from behind. Could have been done on the ship and the body dumped overboard, or he could have been hit on the dock and fallen in. Any luck identifying him? We're running prints, but it'll take time. What I can tell you is that he wasn't James Morrison, at least not the James Morrison who made the reservation. Ran that name through every database we have, and it's cleaner than a Sunday sermon. Either it's an alias, or somebody made it up out of whole cloth." Wolfe looked up from his blueprints. "Inspector, what is the current status of the Aphrodite?" "Scheduled to sail at 8:30. Coast Guard cleared her this afternoon. All safety inspections passed. Crew manifest approved. Passenger list verified. As far as the official record is concerned, she's ready to go. And unofficially," Kramer's expression darkened, "unofficially, I've got a dead man in the harbor, a missing ship owner, a possibly kidnapped chief engineer, and a private investigator telling me there's a plot to sink a luxury liner full of VIPs. But unofficial doesn't stop ships from sailing." The phone rang. I grabbed it, hoping for good news and expecting more frustration. Nero Wolfe's office. "Goodwin?" The voice was tense, unfamiliar. "This is Dmitry Kozlov, first officer of the Aphrodite. I need to speak with Mr. Wolfe immediately." I looked at Wolfe and nodded. He picked up his extension. "Mr. Kozlov, I understand you have information regarding the sabotage of your vessel." "Mr. Wolfe, I don't have much time. I'm calling from the ship. And if they discover me..." He paused, and I heard voices in the background. "Someone has been systematically destroying the Aphrodite's safety systems, not damaging them. That would be noticed. Replacing them with equipment that looks identical, but will fail when needed most." "You've seen this sabotage personally?" "I've been investigating it since Morrison. The real Morrison came to me 3 days ago with his suspicions. That's why he was killed. And that's why Sarah Blackwood is in hiding. We were working together to gather evidence." "And what did you discover?" "The life preservers have been treated with a chemical that will dissolve them after 30 minutes in salt water. The emergency flares are filled with sand instead of phosphorus. The watertight door mechanisms have been sabotaged, so they'll jam closed after one use. And the radio equipment..." He paused again. "The radio equipment has been modified so that any distress signal will be automatically jammed." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. This wasn't just sabotage. It was a carefully planned execution. "Mr. Kozlov, who else knows about this?" "Besides the saboteur, just myself, Sarah. And now you. Captain Larson suspects something is wrong, but he doesn't know the extent of it. And Mr. Wolfe, the passengers begin boarding in 2 hours. If we can't stop this..." "Where are you now?" "In the communications room. But I can't stay here long. They're doing final equipment checks, and if they find me..." Who is they, Mr. Kozlov? I don't know for certain, but I have suspicions. There are 3 passengers who boarded early this afternoon using crew passes, the mysterious Morrison, Wagner and Santos. They claim to be inspecting their accommodations, but they've been asking questions about ship operations that passengers shouldn't need to know. What sort of questions? Emergency procedures, lifeboat locations, communication protocols, and one of them, the one calling himself Wagner, was asking about the ship's fuel capacity and engine specifications. Why would a passenger need to know how long we can run on auxiliary power? Wolfe's eyes met mine across the desk. We were both thinking the same thing. Someone was planning to disable the ship's main engines, forcing her to rely on emergency systems that had been sabotaged to fail. Mr. Kozlov, can you prevent the ship from sailing? Not without proof, and not without Captain Larsen's authorization. But Mr. Wolfe, there's something else. I overheard Wagner talking to someone on a radio, not the ship's radio, a portable unit. He mentioned something about the deep water locations and making sure there are no survivors to tell stories. Did you hear anything else? Just one thing. He said the operation would commence once they were beyond the continental shelf. Mr. Wolfe, that's at least 12 hours out of New York. If something happens to the ship that far from shore, the chances of rescue would be minimal. Exactly. And with the safety equipment sabotaged, even if someone did pick up a distress signal, there wouldn't be anyone left alive to rescue. The line crackled with static, then went dead. Wolfe set down his phone and looked at Kramer, who had been listening to the conversation with growing alarm. Inspector, I believe we now have sufficient grounds to prevent the Aphrodite from sailing. Maybe, but it'll take time to get the paperwork, and time is what we don't have. That ship starts boarding passengers in 90 minutes. I stood up, reaching for my coat. Then we don't wait for paperwork. Kramer, can you get us aboard that ship? Probably. But Goodwin, if we're wrong about this, if it really is just a series of coincidences and equipment failures, we'll be ending the careers of everyone involved. And if we're right, Wolfe said quietly, we'll be saving 800 lives. Mrs. Ashworth appeared in the doorway, her face pale but determined. Mr. Wolfe, I'm going with you. Absolutely not, madam. The situation aboard that vessel is extremely dangerous. It's my husband's ship, Mr. Wolfe. If Charles is involved in this, willing or not, I need to be there. And if these people have hurt him, her voice trailed off. But her meaning was clear. I looked at Wolfe, then at Kramer, then back at Mrs. Ashworth. Outside, the October evening was closing in, and across the city, the Aphrodite waited like a beautiful trap prepared by expert hunters. All right, I said, but we do this my way. No heroics, no unnecessary risks. And if I tell you to run, you run. Understood? She nodded. Wolfe stood up, an event that always carried a certain geological significance. Archie, there's one more thing. Call Saul Panzer, and tell him to bring Fred Durkin and Ori Cather to Pier 47 immediately. If we're boarding that ship, we're going armed and in numbers. You really think it's going to be that dangerous? I think, Archie, that we are about to confront people who have planned the largest mass murder in maritime history since the Titanic. They've killed at least twice to protect their plan, and they won't hesitate to kill again. But they made a critical error. They assumed that murder at sea would be undetectable, untraceable, and unpunishable. They're about to discover that the ocean may be vast, but justice has a longer reach. I made the calls while Wolfe armed himself with his favorite .38, and Mrs. Ashworth sat in the front room, staring out the window like a woman watching for the end of the world. In 1 hour, the Aphrodite would begin boarding her passengers. In 2 hours, she would sail into the darkness of the North Atlantic, and somewhere in that darkness, 800 people would face a choice between survival and death that they didn't even know they were making. We had that long to stop it. Time to go to sea. The Aphrodite at dusk was something to behold. A floating palace blazed with lights, her white hull gleaming against the darkening water like a jewel set in black velvet. Under different circumstances, I might have admired the sight. Under these circumstances, she looked like a beautifully decorated coffin. The passenger boarding had begun, and well-dressed people streamed up the gangway, carrying luggage and expectations of a pleasant Atlantic crossing. They had no idea they might be walking into the most elaborate death trap ever devised. Kramer's badge got us past the dock security, but getting aboard the ship itself required more finesse. Captain Larson met us at the foot of the gangway, a lean, weathered man with the kind of eyes that had seen too much ocean to be easily fooled. "Inspector," he said, shaking Kramer's hand, "I understand you have concerns about my ship." "Captain, we have reason to believe there may be sabotage equipment aboard the Aphrodite, and that some of your passengers may not be who they claim to be." Larson's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. "I see. And what would you like me to do about it?" "For starters," I said, "we need to locate 3 passengers who boarded early using crew passes, the ones registered as Morrison, Wagner, and Santos. We also need to find your first officer, Dmitry Kozlov. Kozlov's in his cabin, as far as I know. As for the early boarding passengers," he paused, consulting a clipboard. "They're in staterooms A12, A15, and A18 on the first-class deck. But gentlemen, I can't allow you to harass paying passengers without more than suspicions." Mrs. Ashworth stepped forward. "Captain Larson, I'm Victoria Ashworth. This is my husband's ship." The captain's demeanor changed immediately. "Mrs. Ashworth, I didn't know you were. That is, I haven't seen Mr. Ashworth today. Is he aboard?" "That's what we're trying to determine, Captain. These people believe someone is planning to sabotage the Aphrodite during her maiden voyage. If there's even a chance they're right." Larson looked at his ship, then at the passengers still boarding, then back at us. "Very well, but I want to be present for any confrontations with passengers or crew. This is still my ship." We made our way up the gangway and into the ship's opulent interior. The Aphrodite was even more impressive inside. All polished wood and brass fittings, with the kind of understated luxury that whispered of serious money. Under other circumstances, it would have been pleasant to explore. Our first stop was Dmitry Kozlov's cabin. The first officer answered our knock, looking like a man who'd been expecting bad news and had just received confirmation of his worst fears. "Mr. Kozlov," I said, "we need to talk." He stepped back to let us into the small but efficient cabin. Maps and technical manuals covered every surface, and I noticed that several of them dealt with emergency procedures and safety systems. "You received my message," he said. It wasn't a question. We did, and now we need specifics. Show us exactly what's been sabotaged and how. For the next 20 minutes, Kozlov led us through a catalogue of systematic destruction that was as impressive as it was terrifying. The saboteurs hadn't simply damaged things. They'd replaced critical safety equipment with items that looked identical, but would fail catastrophically when needed most. "The life preservers appear normal," he explained, showing us one from an emergency locker. "But they've been treated with a chemical that dissolves the flotation material after exposure to salt water. In an emergency, people would put them on, jump into the ocean, and discover too late that they were wearing useless fabric. How long would it take for the chemical to work? Perhaps 30 minutes in cold Atlantic water. Long enough for people to get away from the ship, not long enough for rescue." Captain Larson examined the life preserver with the focused attention of a man whose professional reputation depended on such details. "This is sophisticated. Whoever did this knows maritime safety systems intimately." "It gets worse," Kozlov continued, leading us to the communications room. "The radio equipment has been modified so that any emergency transmission triggers an automatic jamming signal. A distress call would be sent, but it would be immediately scrambled into gibberish." I looked at the radio setup, which appeared completely normal to my untrained eye. How would anyone know to look for that? They wouldn't. In an emergency, the radio operator would send the distress call, hear static in response, and assume the equipment had been damaged. By the time they realized the jamming was intentional, it would be too late. Mrs. Ashworth had been quiet during this recital of horrors, but now she spoke up. "Mr. Kozlov, could one person have done all this?" "No, madam. This required a team. People with access to the ship during construction. People who understood both electronics and maritime safety systems. and people with enough time and resources to obtain or manufacture fake equipment. Or, Kramer said grimly, people working for an organization with those resources. This sounds like the work of professionals. We made our way toward the first-class deck, where our mysterious early boarding passengers were supposedly settled in their staterooms. The ship's corridors were filling with the sounds of a vessel preparing to sail, crew members making final preparations, passengers exploring their accommodations, the distant rumble of engines warming up. Stateroom A12 was our first stop. I knocked on the door and waited. Yes? The voice was male, with a slight accent that could have been German or something else entirely. Ship security, sir. Routine check before sailing. The door opened to reveal a man of medium height with brown hair and the kind of unremarkable features that would make him invisible in a crowd. He looked at our group with the polite attention of a passenger dealing with minor inconvenience. "Heinrich Wagner," he said, extending his hand to Captain Larsen. "I was just admiring my accommodations. Quite impressive." "Mr. Wagner," Larsen replied, "these gentlemen are with the police. They'd like to ask you a few questions." Something flickered behind Wagner's eyes. So briefly I might have imagined it, but I'd learned to trust my instincts about such things. "Of course. How can I help?" "For starters," Kramer said, "we'd like to see some identification." Wagner reached into his jacket, with the casual motion of a man producing a wallet, but what he pulled out instead was a compact automatic pistol that he held with the easy familiarity of someone who'd used such tools before. "I'm afraid that won't be possible, Inspector." The corridor suddenly felt very small and very quiet. Behind Wagner I could see into his stateroom, where a radio setup that definitely didn't belong to the ship's standard equipment sat on the desk. "Now, gentlemen," Wagner continued, his accent becoming more pronounced, "I suggest we all move into my cabin and discuss this situation calmly. Mrs. Ashworth, you'll join us, of course." We moved into the stateroom, under the persuasion of Wagner's pistol. As soon as the door closed behind us, I heard footsteps in the corridor outside, more than one person, moving with the purposeful stride of people who knew exactly where they were going. "Your associates?" I asked. "Santos and Morrison, yes. We've been monitoring your investigation, Mr. Goodwin. Very thorough work, but ultimately pointless." "Because you're going to kill us?" Wagner smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. "Because in 30 minutes this ship will be beyond the territorial waters of the United States, and in 12 hours she'll be over the deepest part of the Atlantic Ocean. What happens to a few interfering investigators will be irrelevant compared to what happens to 800 passengers and crew." "Why?" Mrs. Ashworth's voice was steady, but I could see her hands trembling. "What could possibly be worth so many lives?" "Politics, Mrs. Ashworth. Your country has been uncooperative in certain international matters. Several passengers aboard this ship have been particularly troublesome. Senator Morrison's committee has been investigating financial relationships that should remain private. Justice Chen has been writing opinions that interfere with legitimate business arrangements. Ambassador Rousseau's wife has been negotiating treaties that would damage certain economic interests. So you're going to murder 800 people to eliminate a few politicians. We're going to eliminate obstacles to international cooperation, Mrs. Ashworth. The fact that it requires the sacrifice of innocent lives is regrettable but necessary." Outside the stateroom, I could hear the ship's engines changing pitch. The Aphrodite was preparing to leave port. We were running out of time, and we were trapped in a floating prison with professional killers who had spent months planning the perfect mass murder. But Wagner had made one mistake. He'd underestimated Nero Wolfe's reach, because somewhere in the ship, Saul Panzer, Fred Durkin, and Ori Cather were moving through the corridors, armed and dangerous, and looking for trouble. And in my experience, when Wolfe's operatives go looking for trouble, they usually find it. The question was whether they'd find it in time. The door to Wagner's stateroom opened without a knock, and Saul Panzer stepped inside like he owned the place. Behind him came Fred Durkin, all 250 pounds of him, with Ori Cather bringing up the rear. Wagner spun toward them, his pistol swinging away from us for just a moment. That was all the opening I needed. I dove forward, catching Wagner around the waist, and driving him back into the cabin's writing desk. His gun went flying, clattering across the floor to land near Mrs. Ashworth's feet. She picked it up with the decisive motion of a woman who'd had enough of being threatened. "Gentlemen," Saul said calmly, as if he'd just arrived for afternoon tea, "I believe you're needed elsewhere." Wagner was stronger than he looked, but 20 years of wrestling with suspects had taught me a few things. I got him in an arm lock and held him still while Kramer produced handcuffs. "The other two," Wagner said through gritted teeth. "Santos and Morrison. They're in the engine room." "Why the engine room?" Kramer demanded. "Because that's where the real sabotage is, Inspector," said a new voice from the doorway. Dmitry Kozlov appeared, slightly out of breath. "I'd been searching the ship while you were dealing with our friend here. The life preservers and radio equipment were just misdirection. The real target is the ship's emergency systems." We left Wagner in Fred Durkin's capable hands and followed Kozlov toward the ship's lower decks. The engine room was 5 levels down, deep in the belly of the Aphrodite, and as we descended, I could feel the vibration of the massive turbines that drove her through the water. "What exactly are they planning?" I asked as we hurried through increasingly narrow corridors. "From what I've pieced together, they've installed explosive charges in the emergency bulkhead system," Kozlov explained. "When detonated, they'll prevent the watertight doors from closing. If something happens to breach the hull, the ship floods and sinks, instead of being contained to one compartment." Captain Larson finished grimly. We reached the engine room to find it strangely quiet. The massive turbines hummed with mechanical precision, but there were no crew members visible.
Where is everyone?
Kramer asked. "Shift change," Larson said, consulting his watch. "The evening watch doesn't start for another 10 minutes. That explained the timing. Santos and Morrison, whoever they really were, had planned this window of opportunity when they could work on the emergency systems without interruption. A sound from deeper in the engine room caught my attention, voices speaking in a language I didn't recognize, punctuated by the occasional clank of metal on metal. We moved carefully through the maze of pipes and machinery toward the sound. The engine room of a ship like the Aphrodite is a temple to human engineering, massive, complex, and filled with enough potential energy to power a small city. It's also the perfect place to commit sabotage, because there are so many critical systems that one small change can have catastrophic consequences. We found them near the emergency bulkhead controls. 2 men working with the focused concentration of professionals who knew exactly what they were doing. One was installing what looked like a small electronic device on the control panel, while the other stood guard with a submachine gun that looked serious enough to stop a charging elephant. "Santos and Morrison, I presume?" I said quietly to Kramer. The guard heard me. He spun around, bringing his weapon to bear, but Ori Cather was already moving. 20 years of working for Wolfe had taught all of us that hesitation gets you killed. Ori's shot took the guard in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his weapon skittering across the deck plates. The other man, Santos or Morrison, depending on which false identity he was using, raised his hands slowly. "Very impressive," he said in accented English, "but ultimately pointless. Because the charges are already in place and armed. In approximately 10 minutes, when this ship crosses into international waters, they will detonate automatically. The emergency systems will be destroyed, and the Aphrodite will be unable to contain flooding from any hull breach." Captain Larson stepped forward. "And you're planning to breach the hull?" "Not immediately. We want the ship well out to sea first, beyond any hope of rescue. But yes, eventually there will be an explosion in the forward cargo hold, small but sufficient to open the hull to the sea." I looked at Kozlov, who was examining the device Santos had been installing. "Can you disarm it?" "Perhaps, but not quickly. This is sophisticated equipment, military grade, with multiple fail-safes. It would take hours to safely remove." "We don't have hours," Larson said. "We have minutes before we reach international waters." Mrs. Ashworth had been quiet during this exchange, but now she spoke up. "Captain, can you turn the ship around? Return to port." Not without a compelling reason. The port authority, the shipping company, the passengers, They'd all demand explanations I can't give, based on the word of a few investigators and a possibly unreliable crew member. Then we give them a compelling reason, I said. Kramer, can you call in a bomb threat? It would work, but it would also mean the end of several careers when the investigation turns up sabotage equipment that's already been disarmed. Better than 800 dead passengers, Mrs. Ashworth pointed out. But before Kramer could reach for his radio, the ship's public address system crackled to life. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Due to a minor technical difficulty, we will be returning to port for a brief inspection. We expect to resume our voyage within a few hours. We apologize for any inconvenience. I looked at Captain Larson, who was staring at the PA speaker with the expression of a man who'd just heard his own voice saying something he'd never said. That wasn't me, he said quietly. The ship's engines changed pitch, and I could feel the deck plates vibrating differently as the Aphrodite began to turn. Wolfe, I said, understanding flooding through me like cold water. Somehow Wolfe is controlling the ship. Impossible, Larson protested. The ship's controls are on the bridge, 5 decks up, and sealed against unauthorized access. But even as he spoke, I heard the sound of footsteps on the metal stairs leading down to the engine room. Heavy, measured footsteps that I would have recognized anywhere. Nero Wolfe descended into the engine room like a mountain coming to visit the valley. Behind him came Sarah Blackwood, carrying what looked like a portable radio unit. Good evening, Wolfe said calmly, as if he'd just arrived for dinner instead of appearing in the bowels of a sabotaged ship. Miss Blackwood has been most helpful in explaining the ship's control systems. Mr. Wolfe, Captain Larson said. How did you, that is, who authorized? I mean, this is my ship. Indeed it is, Captain. And a beautiful ship she is. But she was about to become a tomb for 800 innocent people, and I took the liberty of preventing that outcome. You're controlling the ship from down here? Miss Blackwood is controlling the ship, Captain. I am merely providing direction. It seems that modern vessels like the Aphrodite can be operated from multiple locations, including the engine room, provided one has the proper access codes. Sarah Blackwood stepped forward, looking relieved for the first time since this whole business began. Mr. Wolfe found me at my apartment an hour ago. When I explained what had happened, he convinced me that the only way to save the passengers was to take control of the situation directly. But how did you get aboard? The same way these gentlemen did, Miss Blackwood. I purchased a ticket. I stared at him. Wolfe, you bought a ticket? You hate boats. I despise them, Archie, but I despise mass murder even more. And occasionally, one must visit unpleasant places in order to prevent unpleasant outcomes. Santos, who had been listening to this exchange with growing alarm, suddenly spoke up. You're too late. Even if you return to port, even if you disarm the charges, there are others. This operation involves more than just the 3 of us. Indeed, Wolfe said. It involves at least 17 people, including the man who has been financing your activities, the woman who provided you with ship construction documents, and the government official who arranged for your false identities. Impossible. You can't know that. I know that because I know why you wanted to kill the specific passengers aboard this ship. Senator Morrison's investigation had uncovered financial links between certain American shipping companies and foreign intelligence services. Justice Chen's recent rulings had made it increasingly difficult for those same services to launder money through maritime trade, and Ambassador Rousseau's wife had been negotiating agreements that would have made such laundering impossible. Santos' face had gone pale. You can't prove any of that. On the contrary, while you were installing your explosive devices, my operatives were searching your hotel rooms, your rented warehouse in Brooklyn, and the offices of the man who hired you. We found financial records, communication equipment, and enough evidence to convict every member of your organization. Which was probably true, knowing Wolfe's thoroughness. But even if it wasn't, Santos believed it, which was all that mattered. Now then, Wolfe continued. Miss Blackwood will continue guiding the ship back to port, where Inspector Kramer will arrest you and your associates on charges of conspiracy to commit mass murder. The passengers will be delayed a few hours while the ship is inspected and the sabotage equipment removed. and 800 innocent people will continue to live their lives, unaware of how close they came to death. And Charles Ashworth? Mrs. Ashworth asked quietly. My husband. Where is he? Safe, madam. He's been hidden aboard the ship since yesterday morning, investigating the sabotage from the inside. He'll join us shortly. As if summoned by Wolfe's words, footsteps sounded on the stairs again, and Charles Ashworth descended into the engine room. He was disheveled, unshaven, and looked like he'd spent a very unpleasant night hiding in the ship's cargo hold, but he was very much alive. Mrs. Ashworth ran to him, and for a moment the engine room was filled with the sound of reunion instead of the hum of machinery and the voices of captured saboteurs. Well, I said to Wolfe, another successful case, although I still can't believe you actually got on a boat. Technically, Archie, I am still on a boat, and I fully intend to disembark the moment we reach port. What about the ocean voyage? Mrs. Ashworth did promise you another 100,000 if you could solve Morrison's murder. Wolfe considered this. I believe, Archie, that some fees are not worth collecting. The ocean and I will maintain our mutual understanding. I will return to my house, and it will remain where it belongs. Above us, the ship's engines continued their steady rhythm as the Aphrodite turned toward home, carrying her passengers back to safety instead of forward to disaster. It had been, all in all, a very successful evening. Even if we were still technically at sea, by the time the Aphrodite reached port, word of the thwarted sabotage had spread through the ship like wildfire through dry grass. Passengers, who had been looking forward to a pleasant Atlantic crossing, found themselves instead witnesses to one of the most elaborate assassination plots in maritime history. The ship's main lounge had been converted into an impromptu interrogation room, with Captain Larson's permission and Inspector Kramer's authority. Santos and Wagner sat under guard, their false Morrison having been identified as a Bulgarian operative named Petrov, whose real name was probably something else entirely. Mrs. Ashworth sat beside her husband, holding his hand like she was afraid he might disappear again if she let go. Wolfe had commandeered a chair that groaned alarmingly under his weight, but held firm, as furniture generally did when pressed into his service. He sat facing the assembled group like a judge, preparing to deliver a verdict, which in a way, I suppose he was. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice carrying easily through the luxurious lounge. We have spent the past 24 hours investigating what appeared to be a simple case of maritime sabotage. What we discovered instead was something far more complex, a carefully orchestrated conspiracy involving international espionage, political assassination, and the planned murder of 800 innocent people. Senator Morrison, who had been among the passengers and had insisted on attending this impromptu trial, leaned forward. Mr. Wolfe, are you saying this was all directed at specific passengers? Indeed, Senator, specifically at you, Justice Chen, and Mrs. Rousseau. Your investigations, judicial decisions, and diplomatic negotiations had become inconvenient for certain foreign interests. Justice Chen, a small woman with sharp eyes and the bearing of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in the room, spoke up. What sort of foreign interests? The sort that had been using American shipping companies to launder money for intelligence operations, madam. The sort that found your recent rulings on maritime commerce increasingly problematic. The sort that viewed Ambassador Rousseau's trade negotiations as a direct threat to their financial arrangements. But why kill everyone aboard? Mrs. Rousseau asked. Surely there were simpler ways to eliminate 3 people. Ah, but that's where you misunderstand the scope of their ambition, Wolfe replied. This was never about eliminating 3 individuals. This was about creating a maritime disaster so shocking, so tragic, that it would reshape American shipping policy for decades to come. He paused, letting that sink in. Outside the lounge windows, I could see the lights of New York Harbor growing brighter as we approached the dock. Consider the aftermath of such a disaster, Wolfe continued. The Aphrodite, pride of the American merchant fleet, sinks on her maiden voyage with massive loss of life. Investigation reveals systematic failures in safety equipment, failures that appear to be the result of cost-cutting and negligent oversight by American shipping companies. Charles Ashworth's face had gone pale. They wanted to destroy confidence in American maritime commerce.
Exactly, Mr. Ashworth.
In the wake of such a disaster, new regulations would be demanded. Foreign shipping companies would be invited to assist in creating new safety standards. International oversight would be imposed on American ports and shipping lines. And the same foreign interests that planned this atrocity would position themselves to profit from the chaos they had created. Diabolical, Senator Morrison muttered. But surely the investigation would have revealed the sabotage.
Would it, Senator?
The sabotage was extraordinarily sophisticated, designed to appear as equipment failure rather than deliberate destruction. The life preservers would have disintegrated in salt water, but who would think to test them for chemical treatment? The radio jamming would have seemed like equipment damage from the disaster itself. The explosive charges in the emergency bulkhead system would have been destroyed in the sinking, leaving no trace of their existence. Wagner, who had been silent since his capture, suddenly spoke up. "You understand nothing, Wolfe. This was about more than money or shipping regulations. Enlighten me. Your country has been interfering in matters that are none of your concern. Trade routes that have existed for centuries, financial arrangements that predate your republic, spheres of influence that Americans seem to think they can reshape at will." His accent was becoming more pronounced as his composure cracked. Sometimes a lesson must be taught dramatically enough that it cannot be ignored. And 800 innocent lives were an acceptable price for that lesson. Innocent? Wagner laughed bitterly. Your passengers were among the wealthiest and most influential people in America. Their deaths would have been mourned, investigated, and avenged, the perfect catalyst for the policy changes we required. Justice Chen stood up, her small frame radiating the kind of controlled fury that had made her famous in legal circles. You planned to murder children, Mr. Wagner. Families, people whose only crime was being able to afford a first-class ticket. Collateral damage. Justice Chen. Regrettable but necessary. Regrettable, Wolfe repeated, his voice dropping to the rumble that usually preceded someone having a very bad day. You speak of regret, Mr. Wagner, but I see none in your eyes. You speak of necessity, but what I see is the banal evil of men who have convinced themselves that their political goals justify any atrocity. He stood up, an event that always carried a certain geological significance. But you made several critical errors in your planning. Such as, first, you underestimated the intelligence and integrity of the people investigating the sabotage. Morrison, Kozlov, and Miss Blackwood were neither easily fooled nor easily intimidated. Sarah Blackwood, who had been quiet throughout the proceedings, nodded grimly. When I realized what had been done to the safety systems, I knew it had to be more than random vandalism. The sophistication, the systematic nature, it had to be the work of professionals. Second, Wolfe continued, you overestimated your ability to control information. Every conversation, every financial transaction, every forged document left traces that could be followed by competent investigators. Impossible, Santos protested. We used encrypted communications, cash transactions, false identities, all of which were penetrated by my operatives while you were busy with your sabotage, Wolfe said calmly. Mr. Panzer, would you care to elaborate? Saul stepped forward, consulting a notebook. 3 bank accounts in the Cayman Islands, 2 in Switzerland, 1 in Montenegro. Financial records showing payments totaling $12 million over the past 18 months. Communication intercepts revealing coordination with operatives in 7 countries. And most interesting of all, a recording of a conversation between Wagner and his controller, made from the hotel room next to his. Wagner's face went through several shades of pale. You were watching us from the beginning. Not from the beginning, no. But once Mrs. Ashworth hired me to investigate the sabotage, I took the liberty of having all interested parties observed. The watchers, it seems, were also being watched. But your third and most critical error, Wolfe said, settling back into his chair, was assuming that distance from the consequences of your actions would grant you immunity from justice. You planned your atrocity to occur in international waters, beyond the immediate reach of American law enforcement. Which it would have been, Wagner said defiantly. Perhaps, but you failed to account for one crucial factor, the human element. You assumed that your victims would die quietly, that your sabotage would work perfectly, that no one would survive to tell the story of what really happened. You planned for every technical contingency, except the most important one, which was that people like Morrison, Kozlov and Miss Blackwood would risk their lives to protect strangers, that Inspector Kramer would take the word of a private detective seriously enough to act on it, that Mrs. Ashworth would hire investigators despite the personal cost, that ordinary people, when faced with extraordinary evil, would choose to fight rather than submit. Wolfe looked around the lounge, taking in the faces of the passengers who had unknowingly been marked for death. You planned to commit mass murder as a political statement, gentlemen. What you accomplished instead was to demonstrate that human decency, properly organized and intelligently directed, can defeat any conspiracy, no matter how elaborate or well-funded. Outside, I could see the dock approaching. Soon we'd be back on solid ground, and this floating interrogation would move to more conventional venues. But for now, in this luxurious lounge aboard a ship that should have been at the bottom of the Atlantic, justice was being served with the kind of precision that made me proud to work for Nero Wolfe. Inspector Kramer, Wolfe said, I believe you have sufficient evidence to proceed with formal charges. More than sufficient, Kramer agreed. Murder, conspiracy to commit terrorism, sabotage, and about a dozen other charges that'll keep these gentlemen busy for the next several decades. And the rest of their organization? My colleagues in 7 countries are making arrests as we speak, based on the information your operatives provided. This particular conspiracy is finished. The ship's engines changed pitch as we approached the dock. Soon the Aphrodite would be tied up safely in New York Harbor, her passengers disembarking to continue lives they didn't know had almost ended in the deep Atlantic. But first, there was one more piece of business to conclude. Mrs. Ashworth, Wolfe said, I believe we agreed on a fee of $100,000 to identify the saboteur, with an additional sum if I could prove Morrison's murder. Of course, Mr. Wolfe, though after what you've done tonight, it seems inadequate. On the contrary, madam, it's precisely adequate. However, I'm prepared to offer you a significant discount. Sir? The case is solved, justice will be served, and 800 lives have been saved. Under the circumstances, I believe my satisfaction is sufficient compensation. Send me a bill for my ticket, and we'll call it even. Mrs. Ashworth stared at him. Mr. Wolfe, that's extraordinarily generous. It's extraordinarily practical, madam. Money is useful, but there are some experiences that cannot be purchased at any price. Tonight I learned that the ocean, while still vast and mysterious, is no match for human intelligence properly applied. Does this mean you might consider taking maritime cases in the future? Wolfe's expression suggested he'd rather eat boiled cardboard. Madam, let us not get carried away with sentiment. I solved this case despite being at sea, not because of it. My next encounter with the ocean will be from the safety of my office, through the medium of books and newspapers. The Aphrodite bumped gently against the dock, and I felt the familiar relief that comes with returning to solid ground after an adventure at sea. Even if the adventure had been worth it, even if we'd saved 800 lives and stopped an international conspiracy, I was still ready to get back to the brownstone and Fritz's cooking and the comfortable routine of terrestrial crime solving. But as we prepared to disembark, I couldn't help but feel a certain pride in what we'd accomplished. We'd boarded a death trap and turned it back into a luxury liner. We'd faced professional killers and international conspirators, and we'd won. Not bad for a night's work, even if it had involved getting on a boat. 3 days later, I was back in the office with my feet up on my desk, reading the morning papers and marveling at how quickly extraordinary events become ordinary news. The New York Times had given the story front-page treatment, under the headline International Plot to Sink Luxury Liner, Thwarted by Private Detective. But by day 3, we'd been relegated to page 4, squeezed between a subway strike and a mayoral corruption scandal. Wolfe sat behind his desk with his morning beer and the satisfied expression of a man who had solved a particularly challenging crossword puzzle. The routine had reasserted itself immediately upon our return. Breakfast with Fritz morning mail, sorted with Swiss precision, and the comfortable rhythm of a life lived according to immutable principles. Any regrets about turning down Mrs. Ashworth's fee? I asked. None whatever. Money is replaceable, Archie. The satisfaction of preventing mass murder is not. Even if it meant getting on a boat. Especially because it meant getting on a boat. There's something to be said for facing one's fears in service of a greater good. I folded the newspaper and tossed it onto my desk. The phone had been ringing all morning with reporters wanting follow-up interviews, potential clients impressed by our maritime adventure, and various officials trying to tie up loose ends. I'd fielded most of them with my usual charm and efficiency. But sooner or later Wolfe would have to deal with some of the attention. Speaking of which, I said, Inspector Kramer called an hour ago. The arraignment for Wagner, Santos and Petrov is scheduled for tomorrow morning. He wants to know if you'll testify. If necessary, though I suspect their attorneys will advise them to accept whatever plea arrangement the prosecutor offers. The evidence is overwhelming, and their prospects at trial are dim. What about their controllers, the people who financed the operation? 7 arrests in 5 countries, according to the morning briefing from the FBI. The conspiracy extended further than even I had initially suspected. Shipping executives in 3 countries, intelligence operatives from 2 different services, and enough money to fund a small war. All to kill 3 people and sink confidence in American shipping. All to reshape international maritime commerce in ways that would have benefited their sponsors for decades to come. The deaths were incidental to the larger goal, which makes them somehow more reprehensible. The doorbell rang. I heard Fritz's footsteps in the hall, followed by the murmur of voices. A moment later, he appeared in the office doorway. Archie, there's a lady here to see you and Mr. Wolfe. She says her name is Sarah Blackwood. I looked at Wolfe, who nodded. Show her in, Fritz. Sarah Blackwood entered, looking like she'd slept for the first time in weeks. The strain and fear were gone from her face, replaced by the calm competence I associated with people who had faced genuine danger and survived it. Mr. Wolfe, Mr. Goodwin, she said, settling into the red leather chair. I wanted to thank you both personally for what you did. No thanks are necessary, Miss Blackwood. You took considerable risks to expose the sabotage. We merely provided assistance. More than assistance, you saved my life, and the lives of 800 other people. What will happen to the Aphrodite? I asked. She's being completely overhauled. Every safety system, every piece of equipment, everything the saboteurs touched is being replaced. The maiden voyage has been postponed for 2 months, but she'll sail again.
And you?
I've been offered the position of Chief of Maritime Safety for the entire Meridian Fleet. Charles Ashworth said that anyone who could spot sabotage that's sophisticated deserved to be in charge of preventing it in the future. Congratulations. Thank you. But I have to ask, Mr. Wolfe, how did you know to look for me at my apartment that night? How did you know I was still alive? Wolfe leaned back in his chair, considering the question. Several factors. Miss Blackwood. First, the man who threatened you made a critical error. He asked you to replace the evidence of sabotage with false documentation. If his goal had been simply to cover up the sabotage, he would have asked you to destroy the evidence entirely. I don't understand. By asking you to replace real evidence with false evidence, he revealed that he wanted the sabotage to be discovered, but only after the ship was beyond rescue. He needed you alive to create that false documentation, which meant he had no immediate plans to kill you. But why take the risk of keeping me alive? Because killing you too soon would have raised questions about the sabotage before the ship sailed. Morrison's death was already suspicious. Adding yours would have attracted unwanted attention. Better to keep you alive and frightened until the ship was safely at sea, where I would have died with everyone else. Indeed, but the saboteur's tactical intelligence exceeded his strategic understanding. He successfully kept you alive long enough to serve his purposes, but he failed to anticipate that you might be found and persuaded to help stop the very sabotage you were being forced to conceal. Miss Blackwood was quiet for several moments, apparently contemplating how close she'd come to death. Outside, a taxi honked, and somewhere in the house, I could hear one of the Dobermans padding through the halls on routine patrol. There's one more thing, she said finally. I've been asked to testify before Senator Morrison's committee about maritime security. They want to know how such elaborate sabotage could be planned and executed without being detected. And what will you tell them? The truth. that the safety systems we rely on are only as secure as the people responsible for them, that sophisticated enemies require sophisticated defenses, and that sometimes the difference between tragedy and triumph comes down to a few good people willing to risk everything to do what's right. An admirable philosophy, Miss Blackwood. She stood to leave, then paused at the office door. Mr. Wolfe, would you ever consider taking another maritime case? Miss Blackwood, I have made my peace with the ocean. We have agreed to coexist at a respectful distance. I see no need to renegotiate that arrangement. Even for a very large fee, even for an enormous fee, some experiences, however successful, need not be repeated. After she left, I looked at Wolfe, who was already reaching for the morning mail, with the focused attention of a man returning to familiar routines. So, I said, back to terrestrial crime solving. Indeed, though I confess, Archie, that there was something satisfying about matching wits with opponents of such ambition and sophistication. Even if it meant getting on a boat. The boat was incidental to the intellectual challenge. The fact that we succeeded despite my maritime antipathy merely proves that intelligence properly applied can overcome any obstacle, including your fear of the ocean. I was never afraid of the ocean, Archie. I simply recognized it as an environment unsuited to my particular talents and preferences. The events of the past few days have not changed that assessment. But you got on the boat anyway. I boarded that ship because 800 lives hung in the balance, because a conspiracy of international scope required intervention, and because justice demanded action regardless of personal discomfort. And because Mrs. Ashworth was paying us $200,000, that too was a factor. Yes. I grinned at him. Admit it, Wolfe. For about 6 hours there, you were a man of action. I am always a man of action, Archie. The action simply usually takes place in this office, with my feet firmly planted on solid ground. He opened the first letter of the day, a sure sign that our maritime adventure was officially over. Now shall we return to the business at hand? I believe we have 3 potential cases to consider, none of which involve boats, ships, or any other form of maritime transport. Suits me fine, though I have to admit, it was kind of exciting, racing against time to stop a mass murder. It was necessary, Archie, but excitement is overrated. Give me a good murder in a drawing room, with clearly defined suspects and evidence that can be examined without leaving Manhattan. Speaking of which, the phone's been ringing all morning with potential clients. Word of our maritime success seems to have impressed people. Then perhaps some good will come of our aquatic adventure after all. But for now, let us concentrate on crimes that can be solved from the comfort of this office, with Fritz's cooking within easy reach and my orchids safely upstairs. Outside, New York hummed with its usual energy, and somewhere in the city, people were undoubtedly committing the sorts of crimes that would eventually require our attention. But for now, the brownstone was peaceful. The morning mail promised nothing more dangerous than bills and social invitations, and Nero Wolfe was safely back in his element. The ocean would have to manage without us, at least until the next time justice required us to venture beyond the familiar borders of West 35th Street. But knowing Wolfe's feelings about maritime travel, that was likely to be a very long time indeed. The Aphrodite would sail again in 2 months, carrying passengers who would never know how close they'd come to disaster. And in this office, behind this familiar desk, we'd continue solving the kinds of mysteries that could be unraveled through intelligence, persistence, and careful attention to human nature, which, when you got right down to it, was more than enough excitement for any reasonable man, even if it occasionally required getting on a boat.